Spencer Holloway typed her name into the seating system himself, which was not something he ever did. He had people for guest lists, people for logistics, an entire events team whose whole function was to keep details like this off his desk. But he wanted to do this one personally. He scrolled to table 11, close enough to the stage that the cameras would catch her in the wide shots, far enough that she'd have to watch the whole thing from a kind of middle distance. And he typed in Caldwell, and then her first name, and then he sat back and looked at it on the screen for a moment, with the quiet satisfaction of a man rearranging the last piece of something he'd been building for a long time. Imani Caldwell. There she was, in the system, in pixels, a guest at the Vance Foundation Gala, where Spencer Holloway would be named Founder of the Year. For the company they had started together, at a folding table in a one-bedroom apartment. The company he had spent the better part of 3 years convincing the world, the board, and finally himself that he had built alone. He told his assistant to make sure the invitation went out with a handwritten note. He wrote it himself, too. Just a line. Thought you'd want to see how it all turned out. He read it twice, decided it was perfect precisely because it could be read 2 ways, and sealed it. That night, he met 3 men he called his closest friends at a members' club downtown, the kind with no sign on the door and a wine list that started where most people's budgets ended. And when he mentioned that he'd invited Imani, the table came alive. She won't show, said Brandon, who ran a fund and laughed at things before he'd finished hearing them. She fell off the map. What's she going to do, valet, for the night? Trent, who'd been at Halcyon early and left rich and bored, swirled his glass. Last I heard she was teaching. Coding camps or something. Kids. He said kids the way some men say charity, as a thing that happened to people who'd run out of road. Spencer didn't correct them. He didn't actually know what she was doing now, and he found he preferred not to. The picture he carried of her had hardened over 3 years into something convenient and final. Imani at the conference table, the day they pushed her out, dry-eyed, signing the separation papers in that careful handwriting of hers, saying almost nothing. He had taken her silence as the white flag he wanted it to be. He raised his glass to the table and let the laughter wash over him, easy and warm. The laughter of men who have never once had to wonder whether the world was on their side. What none of them understood, because understanding it would have required them to have looked closely at a woman they had all decided early on was background scenery, was what those 3 years had actually been for her. The thing about Imani Caldwell was that she had built her whole life out of being underestimated, and she had learned a long time ago to stop minding. She'd been raised by her grandmother in a 3rd-floor walk-up in Memphis, in a building where the elevator had been broken so long the kids didn't know it had ever worked. Odessa Caldwell cleaned offices on the night shift and came home at 6 in the morning smelling of industrial lemon. And she did not believe in complaining, and she did not believe in waiting for permission. And she put those 2 beliefs into her granddaughter so deep that Imani never thought to question them. There had been a public library 4 blocks away with 2 computers and a librarian named Miss Foley who let Imani stay past closing if she was working on something real. That was where she'd taught herself to code. 12 years old, the screen glow on her face, building little programs that did nothing useful and felt, to her, like proof that the world had a logic underneath it that she could touch. She'd met Spencer at a startup mixer in a borrowed blazer. Both of them broke, both of them hungry, and for a while the hunger had felt like the same hunger. They built the first version of Halcyon together in the apartment they shared, and the truth, the buried and inconvenient truth, was that the core of the thing, the part that actually worked, the data architecture that made the whole company possible, had come out of her head. She'd written most of it at night while he slept, and she had handed it to him in the mornings, and he had carried it into rooms full of investors and presented it with a fluency she did not yet have, and somewhere in the handing over, the authorship had quietly transferred. Not all at once, the way a river moves a bank. A little at a time, until the shape of the thing was different, and no one could quite say when it had changed. She had let it happen. That was the part she'd had to make peace with later. She had let him be the face because she believed in the work more than she believed in the credit. And because she loved him. And because she came from a place where you learned to make yourself small in certain rooms so the thing you were carrying could get through the door. She made the introductions he took credit for. She solved the problems he announced he'd solved. When the company raised its first real money, the term sheet had Spencer's name in the headline and hers in the fine print. And she'd told herself the fine print was where the real work lived anyway, and she'd almost believed it. The marriage and the company failed at roughly the same speed, which is to say slowly, and then all at once. He started leaving her off the invitations to the dinners that mattered. He started introducing her, when he introduced her at all, as the technical co-founder, in a tone that managed to make technical sound like a limitation. He told her one night, over takeout, gone cold, because he'd come home 2 hours late without a call, that she was holding the company back, that she didn't have the presence the next phase required, that investors needed to see a certain kind of leader, and she wasn't it. She had set down her fork and looked at him for a long moment across the small kitchen table that had once been the company's first office. And she had said, very evenly, one day you're going to need to know exactly what you handed away tonight. He hadn't answered. He'd been looking at his phone. The board vote came 8 months later. Spencer had spent those months building a coalition with the patience of a man who had decided something and was simply waiting for the architecture to catch up. They called it a leadership realignment. They gave her a payout that was insulting precisely because it was technically fair, and a separation agreement with a non-disparagement clause, and a line about pursuing other passions for the press release. She signed it all in a glass conference room, while 4 men who had built their careers on her code watched her with expressions arranged into sympathy. She did not cry in that room. She had decided long before she walked in that she would not give them that, and she didn't. She cried that night, alone, sitting on the floor of the apartment she was about to lose, her back against the kitchen cabinets, and she cried hard and quietly for a long time, the way you cry when there's no one to perform it for. And then she stopped. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. She got up. She made tea because her grandmother had always made tea at the worst moments, as a way of insisting that life was continuing. And somewhere in the second cup, sitting at that same scarred table, she felt the grief in her chest cool and harden into something with edges. Not bitterness. Bitterness was a fuel that burned dirty and left you sick. This was cleaner than that. It was clarity. She understood, with a certainty that settled into her like a foundation pour, exactly what she was going to do next. She started Solstice in a co-working space with 2 engineers who believed in her and a line of credit she'd put her own savings against. She built it the way she'd built everything, quietly, from the inside out, by figuring out what the market would need before the market knew to ask. Halcyon's whole value had come from her insight about how systems should talk to one another. Solstice took that insight and went somewhere Spencer's company never could, because Spencer's company had her old ideas, and her old ideas had a ceiling, and only she knew where it was. The first year she landed a single contract, a health network that needed to move enormous amounts of sensitive data without it leaking or breaking, and she delivered so cleanly that they referred her without being asked. By the end of the second year, she had 9 major clients and a reputation in the narrow, serious world of enterprise infrastructure as someone who simply did not miss. By the end of the third, she had a valuation that made the financial press use the word billion, and a name that, in the specific rooms where these things were known, carried real weight. She wasn't famous. She never courted a camera. But the people who mattered knew, and the people who mattered talked, and the talk had a particular quality of respect that money alone never buys. She was reviewing an acquisition memo in her office on the 31st floor when her chief of staff, a sharp and unhurried woman named Dahlia Mercer, set the Vance Foundation invitation on her desk along with Spencer's note. Imani read the note, thought you'd want to see how it all turned out. She set it down. She looked out the window at the city for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and said, "Clear my Thursday." Dahlia, who had been with her since the second year and had learned to read the particular stillness that came over her boss before a decision, raised an eyebrow. "You're going." "I'm going." "You don't have to prove anything to that man." "I know," Imani said. "I'm not going to prove anything. I'm going to close a door I've been leaving open out of politeness." She turned from the window. "And I want you to pull the Halcyon file. The public one, and whatever the diligence team has. I want to read it on the flight." Dahlia paused. "You looking for something?" "No," Imani said. "I just don't like walking into a room I haven't read first." What she didn't say, because it wasn't yet a thought, so much as an instinct, was that she had spent 6 years married to a man whose finances she had once balanced on the back of an envelope, and she knew the difference between a company that was actually winning and a company that was performing the appearance of winning. And from the outside, lately, Halcyon had started to ring a little hollow. The growth numbers were too smooth. The story was too clean. She had built that company's bones, and she could feel, the way you can feel a hairline crack in a floor through your shoes, that something underneath it was wrong. The Vance Foundation Gala was held in the ballroom of a hotel that had been chosen specifically to humble the people walking into it, all marble and 40-foot ceilings and chandeliers that cost more than the building Imani had grown up in. Spencer arrived in a custom suit and moved through the cocktail hour like a man being filmed, which in fact he was. He shook the right hands. He laughed at the right altitude. Beside him, his fiancée, a former gallerist named Camille Arden, wore a column of pale silk and held his arm with the precise pressure of someone who had been coached, and she smiled when the cameras found them, and her eyes moved through the room with a restlessness she couldn't quite still. Camille had been asking about Imani for 2 weeks. She'd asked in the casual way. People ask about things they can't stop thinking about, and Spencer had brushed it off each time. But the brushing had a quality to it, a fraction too fast, a fraction too sure, and Camille had begun to understand that there were rooms inside her fiancé she had not been given a key to. She'd asked him once, gently, why he'd invited his ex-wife at all, to this, of all nights. He'd said something about closure, about being the bigger person, and the answer had sounded reasonable and rung wrong, a coin that looks right until you bite it. She hadn't pushed, she was learning not to. At 7:51 in the evening, a car pulled up to the hotel's main entrance, and a second behind it, and a small, alert detail of people moved out onto the sidewalk with the unhurried economy of professionals. And the doorman, who had worked that entrance for 9 years and seen senators and movie stars come through it, found himself stepping back without being asked. The door of the second car opened, and Imani Caldwell stepped out. She wore black. Not the black of a woman hoping to slip through a room unnoticed, but the deliberate black of a woman who has stopped competing for attention and therefore commands all of it. The cut of the dress was severe and exact. Her hair was natural, the way it had always been, the way that had once embarrassed Spencer in rooms full of people he wanted to impress. And she wore it now like a flag she'd stopped apologizing for. She didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to. She moved through the lobby with the even, economical attention of someone reading a space rather than being awed by it, and 3 different people turned to look at her and forgot to turn back. The shift moved through the ballroom the way temperature does, gradually and then all at once. People near the entrance noticed first. A whisper traveled inward. Spencer felt the change in the room before he located its source. He was mid-handshake with a man from the Vance board, and something in him went still in a way that had nothing to do with composure. He turned. He saw her crossing the floor, and for a moment his mind simply refused the information. Because the woman walking toward table 11 did not match the woman he had spent 3 years keeping safely small in his memory. The Imani he had built and stored away was diminished, brittle, somewhere on the far edge of relevance. This woman looked like someone who had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and used it as a load-bearing wall. Camille leaned into his shoulder. "Who is that?" "That's Imani," he said. His voice came out wrong, and he heard it, and he corrected it. "My ex-wife. I told you she might come." "You didn't tell me she was her," Camille said, very quietly. And Spencer did not have an answer to that, because he was only now watching the room rearrange itself around the woman he'd invited there to feel small, beginning to understand that he had made an error he could not yet measure. Across the room, an older man stopped mid-sentence and stared. Everett Shaw was the kind of investor whose name appeared on the boards of companies most people had never heard of but used every day, a man with 40 years of memory and no patience for the stories powerful people told about themselves. He'd been an early backer of Solstice, one of the first to write a check when the only proof Imani had was a prototype and her own certainty. He set down his glass and began moving toward table 11, and a woman beside him, watching him go, murmured to her companion, "Is that the Solstice founder? I heard she's about to close the biggest infrastructure deal of the year." And within 10 minutes, that sentence had traveled through the room's more attentive corners, the way real news travels among people who trade in it. Spencer intercepted Everett near the edge of the dance floor with the smoothness of long practice. "Everett, glad you could make it." Everett took his hand, but his attention was already past him. "Spencer, that woman who just came in, the one at table 11. A pause. "Is that Imani Caldwell of Solstice?" "My ex-wife," Spencer said, and he loaded the word ex-wife with the dismissiveness of a man filing something undersettled. Everett looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but lived next door to it. "Son," he said, not unkindly, "do you have any idea what that woman has built?" The question hung there. Spencer redirected towards some deal he wanted to talk about, and Everett let him. The way you let a man change the subject when you've already learned everything you needed to know from his face. But the older man's eyes went back to table 11 twice more before they parted. And what was in them was a tired sort of recognition. The recognition of a man who has spent his life watching people rewrite their own histories and has gotten very good at telling the difference between a revision and a theft. Because Everett Shaw remembered. He remembered a meeting, years back, before Halcyon was anything, when a small unknown startup had somehow gotten in front of a room of investors who had no reason to take the meeting. He'd been there, at the edge of it. He remembered being struck by the architecture of the thing, the elegance of how the data moved, and he remembered, distinctly, the woman in the corner who answered the only technical question that actually mattered while the man at the front took the applause. He'd assumed, for years, that the man knew what he had. It was only tonight, watching Spencer Holloway's face come apart by degrees as he understood who his ex-wife had become, that Everett realized Spencer had never known at all. He had been standing on top of something his whole career and had genuinely believed he was the mountain. Everett went and sat with Imani at table 11, and they talked for 20 minutes in the easy shorthand of two people who share a common language of competence. And the room watched them do it, and the watching changed the temperature again. While that happened, in a corridor off the service entrance, a man named Lawrence Pruitt was looking at his phone with a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Lawrence was one of Halcyon's senior financial partners, and he had come to the gala in good faith, and he had spent the last several weeks growing quietly uneasy about a set of numbers that refused to resolve in comfortable directions. The notification that had just arrived was from a forensic analyst he trusted, and what it said, in the dry vocabulary of people who count things for a living, was that Halcyon's headline growth had been propped up for the better part of 2 years by a structure of undisclosed obligations and aggressive revenue recognition that did not survive contact with daylight. The core technology metrics, the ones the whole valuation rested on, had been quietly inflated. Lawrence stood in that corridor and thought about the chandeliers and the custom suit and the Founder of the Year award sitting backstage with Spencer's name engraved on it. And he made a decision, and he went to find Everett Shaw. Camille found out at 9:40, the way people find out the things they've been carefully kept away from, by accident and all at once. She'd stepped into the corridor for air, and overheard, through a door left ajar, the tail end of a conversation between Lawrence Pruitt and a man she didn't know. The words she caught were specific enough that no amount of context would have softened them. Undisclosed liabilities, inflated metrics, the whole valuation's fiction. She stood very still. Then she walked back into the ballroom and looked at Spencer across the room, at the suit and the watch and the laugh he handed out like currency, and she felt the floor go out from under her in a way that had nothing to do with the marble. Inside the ballroom, Imani wasn't doing anything dramatic at all. She was eating. She was listening to the people at her table with what looked like real interest. She didn't look at Spencer with triumph, or with hunger, or with any of the feelings that would have confirmed the story he'd written about her. On the 2 or 3 occasions their eyes met across the room, she looked at him the way you look at a chapter you've already read and understood completely, with a kind of mild, finished recognition. And that, more than any confrontation, was what undid him. He had rehearsed for confrontation. He had a whole inventory of gracious, devastating things prepared for the moment she approached him in tears or anger. He had not prepared for her to simply be in his room, whole and unbothered and entirely herself, carrying not one feeling she hadn't chosen to bring. He started drinking too much. It happened slowly, and then with commitment. By a little past 10, the calculated ease had blurred into something raw, and the people closest to him could feel the shift, even if they couldn't name it. And then, with the momentum of a man who has convinced himself that what he's about to do is his own idea, he crossed the room and stopped in front of her table and looked down at her with a smile that was already failing. "I'm glad you came," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, pitching it for the audience. "It means a lot, knowing you're here to see all this." The tables around them had gone quiet. Imani looked up at him, and her expression was so composed it bordered on gentleness, and she said, clearly and without any hurry at all, "I didn't come for you, Spencer." The room held its breath. His smile stayed up one beat past the point where anyone believed it, and then it hardened into something else. Before he could answer, Everett Shaw rose from his chair with the deliberate weight of a man who has decided something and intends to follow it through. He didn't raise his voice. "I think," he said, in the flat, certain register of a person accustomed to having facts matter, "it's time we talk about some things that are overdue." He glanced toward the edge of the gathering crowd, where Lawrence Pruitt had appeared. Lawrence gave a short nod. What followed was not a scene in the dramatic sense. There was no shouting, no thrown glass. It was quieter than that, and far more absolute. Lawrence Pruitt stated, in the measured language of a man who has concluded that the cost of silence has finally exceeded the cost of speech, that he was suspending his participation in Halcyon's pending financing, pending a full independent audit, and that he advised the others present with exposure to do the same. He said it to Everett technically. The room heard it. A woman named Priscilla, who'd quietly put money into 2 of Halcyon's funding rounds, looked at her phone, then at Lawrence, then at no one, and rose and excused herself toward the doors. Another man followed. The defection moved through the room the way the recognition had earlier, gradually, and then all at once. Camille walked past Spencer without looking at him. She paused only long enough to say one sentence, low, meant for him alone. "You should have told me." Then she kept walking, and the sound of her heels across the marble was the loudest thing in the room for as long as it lasted, and then it faded, and the room filled back in with the careful, hushed noise of people who know they are witnessing something they'll be telling for years, and are already editing their own proximity to it. The band stopped between songs and did not start again. The awards sat backstage, unpresented, and Spencer Holloway stood alone in the middle of the floor he'd chosen for his coronation, a drink going warm in his hand, watching the room he'd built turn its back on him in real time. He looked at Imani. "You did this," he said. His voice had lost the performance. What was left was smaller and more honest, which made it worse. Imani looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "This was already done. I just showed up." The crowd thinned with the efficient grace of people who understand when an evening is over. The catering staff began their quiet work, clearing glasses, restoring the surfaces, treating the wreckage of the night the way they treated every other kind of night, which is to say, with the practiced neutrality of people who have seen the wheel turn many times. Spencer sat down in the chair at the head table that had been reserved for the man of the hour, and he stayed there as the room emptied around him, and he did not move. He didn't hear her approach. He became aware of her only when she was standing a few feet away, not beside him, at a distance that carried no warmth and also no cruelty. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they once loved and can no longer reach. He didn't speak for a moment. When he did, the voice that came out was stripped of everything he'd spent years building. "Did you ever actually believe in it?" he asked. "Use, any of it." It was not the question he'd planned, because he had planned nothing for this moment, having never once believed it would arrive. Imani was quiet. Then she said, "Yes, I did. That was the whole problem. I believed in you longer than the evidence did." He looked at the table in front of him. "I knew what you were worth," he said. "I did know, I just couldn't." He stopped. She waited. She had become, over 3 years, very patient with the things people start and can't finish, with the gaps in sentences where the honest word should go and doesn't. She no longer felt any need to fill them for him. She let this one stay open. He looked up, and for the first time that night his face held something true. "Did you hate me?" She considered it honestly, because she had always cared more about the truth than about mercy, even when people confused the two. "No," she said. "I just stopped trying to rescue someone who'd decided to fall." He looked at her for a long time after that, and his expression was not anger, and not quite pleading. It was older than both, and more interior. It was the look of a man attempting, perhaps for the first time in his life, to see himself as he actually was, rather than as he'd always required himself to be seen. Then he looked away. "I didn't know," he said. It wasn't clear, even to him, what he meant. The company she'd built, the deal he'd never made, the years, himself. She suspected he meant all of it. "I know," she said. It was the kindest thing she said to him all night, and it was not kind. She picked up her clutch from the table. She looked around the ballroom one last time, at the collapsed centerpieces, and the chairs pushed back at the angles that tell the story of sudden departures. At the chandelier, still throwing its light over all of it without judgment, the way chandeliers do. Then she walked out, and her people fell in around her, and the doors closed behind her, and she did not look back because there was nothing in that room that belonged to her anymore, and nothing she needed to take. Camille left Spencer 2 days later. The friends who had laughed at the members' club stopped returning his calls within the week, in the orderly way that such men withdraw their friendship the moment it stops appreciating in value. The audit confirmed everything. The Vance Foundation quietly rescinded the award. The story moved through the industry and then out of it, and within a few months, Spencer Holloway had become the thing he had spent his whole life terrified of being, which was a cautionary tale told by other people, at other dinners, a name attached to a lesson. Imani didn't follow any of it closely. She had a company to run and a deal to close, and she closed it, and Solstice became one of the most important infrastructure firms in the country. And she put a wing on the public library in Memphis where Miss Foley had once let her stay past closing, and she named it after her grandmother. Odessa Caldwell had not lived to see any of it, but Imani thought of her every time she walked into a room. She had once been told she didn't have the presence for, and she walked into all of them now without thinking twice. There is a story people like to tell themselves about betrayal, that the one who's wronged is supposed to carry it, supposed to be marked by it, supposed to wear the evidence of having been discarded for the rest of their life. It's a comfortable story for the people who do the discarding, because it makes the discarding feel final, a verdict that can't be appealed. What Spencer Holloway never understood, what men like him almost never understand, because understanding it would require an imagination they were never made to develop, is that the thing he threw away was not diminished by being thrown. It landed somewhere else. It took root. It became, in the better soil, exactly what it had always been underneath his name, and his story, and his careful little smile. The people who betray us most completely are rarely the ones who shout. They're the ones who smile, who dress our smallness up in the language of inevitability, who invite us to come and witness their triumph, not because they're certain of it, but because, somewhere under the suit and the watch and the curated room, full of people paid to reflect them back at themselves, there's a fear of being nothing that no amount of applause has ever managed to quiet. Imani Caldwell had not gone to that gala to prove a single thing. She had gone to close a door. She closed it, and she walked out into a life that needed nothing from him. Not his apology, not his regret, not even the satisfaction of watching him understand. She had only ever needed to stand in the room, whole and entirely herself, and let the truth do the one thing it had always been waiting to do, which was simply to be seen. The rest took care of itself.